Hi guys, welcome today. So today, unfortunately, I can't be there. So in my place, we have Mr. Hobbs. So I expect you today to show him your full respect. Now, hopefully you already have it out, but you need to have your energy flow and relationships and ecosystems notes that I gave you on Thursday. So you need to have that out and turn to that page in your notebook because today we're going to take some notes on ecosystems. So our lesson today is going to be on energy flow and relationships, which basically just means we're going to see how it is that energy moves in an ecosystem, and we're going to learn about organisms' roles in those ecosystems. So to start, today when we take notes, if it's underlined, it's going to be something that's going to need to get written down in your notes. So if at any point you need a little bit of extra time, please raise your hand and ask Mr. Hobbs to either pause the video or ask him to pause the video. That would work best. So we're going to start today looking at the ranges of study, or we're going to see how it is that an ecosystem is organized. So at the most basic level of an ecosystem, we organize it by the organism. So we say an organism is a single individual or one individual. I'm going to use sort of a school analogy here. If you think of an organism, you can think of yourself. You're the organism. So you're going to be our organism example. A population is considered all organisms of the same species in an area. So you're the organism. The population would be La Colina 7th grade middle school students. So you're all the same because you all go to La Colina and you're all the same species. Next we have the community, which are all biotic factors in the area. So a community is broader than a population. The community would be all 7th grade middle school students in Santa Barbara. So biotic means living, so it'd be all the living students or all the students in Santa Barbara. Ecosystem is comprised of all the biotic and abiotic factors in an area. So an ecosystem also takes into account things like the building, the students, all of the things that make up our school system in Santa Barbara would be part of our ecosystem. Even broader, we have something called a biome, and this is going to be a group of ecosystems with the same climate. Unfortunately, here my school analogy starts to break down. So what we think of as a biome is we can simply just think of it as it's a group of ecosystems with the same climate. Or in Santa Barbara, we would consider this, our climate would be a Mediterranean biome, which basically what that means is that the weather in Santa Barbara is temperate all year round, which means we do not have extreme summers and we do not have extreme winters, so we have a Mediterranean biome. Places in the desert, specifically like Death Valley, have what's considered a desert biome. So we categorize biomes based off their climate. Even broader still, we have what's called a biosphere. So these are going to be all the ecosystems on Earth. This is our most broad level of organization, is the biosphere. We have abiotic and biotic factors in an ecosystem. Biotic factors are going to be living, but first we're going to write down abiotic factors. These are going to be all the non-living physical and chemical aspects of an environment. So things like climate, sunlight, water availability, and pollution are all going to be abiotic factors. So abiotic factors are something that is non-living. We can think of the chemical makeup of soil as another abiotic factor. Now, abiotic factors considered non-living, so that means biotic factors are going to be the living organisms in an environment. So at La Colina, you would be considered the biotic factors because you're living. All of the bugs and other organisms that are living that also live at our school are also the biotic factors. Things like prey, predators, parasites all make up what we consider to be the biotic factors. We have two types of energy users. We have producers, which are going to be organisms that make their own food. We refer to these as autotrophs. So you can think of things like plants as autotrophs. And if you remember when we learned about these earlier, we can also have some bacteria that also have the ability to make their own food. We call those cyanobacteria, and they have the ability to photosynthesize or make their own food as well. So we consider those to be autotrophs. We are in the class of organism known as a consumer, which means we do not have the ability to get our own. We do not have the ability to make our own food, unfortunately, so we have to get our food from other organisms. So we need to get energy from other organisms. We're referred to as heterotrophs because we do not possess the ability to make our own food. So we have producers and consumers. Producers are plants. Producers are plants and some bacteria, and consumers are non-plant and non-cyanobacteria. There are multiple types of consumers. We have herbivores, which is like this tortoise. So herbivores only eat plants. So they're not going to eat any meat whatsoever. They only eat plants. Carnivores only eat animals. So we have this kind of scary looking picture here of a seal looking like it's about to dine on this poor penguin. And so seals are considered carnivores because they only eat meat. Humans are in a unique category, along with some other organisms, in that we have the ability to eat both plants and animals. So we're known as an omnivore. Detritivores are going to be things like this earthworm, which feed on dead plants and animals. We can think of organisms like vultures are another type of detritivore because they feed on the dead or decaying animal matter. Decomposers are things like fungi and bacteria. They break down organic material. So on your paper in a second, it's going to ask for an example or two examples of herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, detritivores, and decomposers. And so you should be getting ready to do that now. Now, decomposer might be the only one that you struggle with, but if you need to write bacteria and fungi to help you out for that, you can do that as well. So your task is with your partner. You're going to write a list in your notes of two types of each consumer. So if you need to pause the video now to give the students some time, please do that. Okay, so hopefully everyone has at least two examples on their paper. If you didn't get a chance to write down two examples, there'll be time at the end of class today where you can write down two examples for each one. So the next part of our ecosystem notes we're going to look at are the feeding relationships. So we're going to see how energy flows in an ecosystem. We say that energy flows in only a single direction. Some people might call this unidirectional. So when we look below, we have a basic energy flow chart. All energy is going to come from the sun. That's going to be our first step in any of our food webs. It's going to start with the sun. Next we have producers, which are things like grasses, trees, plants, flowers, anything that possesses the ability to make energy from the sun is going to be the next in our food web or food chain. Followed by a primary consumer, like a grasshopper, which gets its energy from the grass. The grass gets its energy from the sun. The secondary consumer, the shrew, eats grasshoppers, which eat the grass, which get its energy from the sun. Followed by our tertiary consumer, or the owl, which gets its energy from the secondary consumer, which got its energy from the primary consumer, which got its energy from the producer, which got its energy from the sun. So food chains are really interesting because they show a series of steps with one organism consuming another. Food chains, for the most part, are very basic. and we just use them to get a basic idea in an ecosystem of what is going to eat what, or what is going to get its energy from what. So it only shows one type of organism for each step in this case, and food chains for the most part are very limited. So we tend to like to use food webs, which food webs are a lot more detailed and they give us a lot more information. So what a food web is it's a series of food chains interacting. They show the variety of foods consumed. So what's interesting about food webs is that if we take out even one organism from a food web, it's going to have dire consequences for the rest of the food web. So let's take an example. Let's look at the Douglas squirrel. So here's my Douglas squirrel. If something happened to the Douglas squirrel, say maybe we polluted its area, killing off its food source, which would be a plant, so to the point where all the Douglas squirrels die off, what's going to happen is it's going to have a consequence higher up in the food web. So since the Douglas squirrel has died due to the pollution, the pine marten is going to lose its source of energy. So now what's going to happen is the pine martens are going to slowly die off because they're losing one of their primary sources of energy. Then if the pine martens die off, then the bobcat and the mountain lion are also going to struggle to survive now because their food source, the pine marten, has died. So we can have a consequence from the bottom up, and we can also have the same type of consequence from the top down. If hunters in an environment or in an ecosystem remove all the bobcats, so if they hunt all the bobcats, then what happens is the pine marten loses its primary predator. So that means the pine marten is able to reproduce without being controlled by the bobcat. So then its numbers are going to start to quickly increase. If that happens, then the pine marten's numbers, as they increase, that means that there's going to be a lot more predators to eat the Douglas squirrel. If there's a lot more predation on the Douglas squirrel, then the Douglas squirrel's numbers are going to die off. If all the Douglas squirrels die off, then the pine marten's numbers are going to also plummet because they're going to be losing their food source. So we can have consequences from the bottom up, and we can also have consequences from the top down. So the next type of relationship we're going to look at is the relationship between two organisms that have co-evolved. So we say pollinators and flowers are an example of something known as coevolution, which means that both organisms evolved together, and they evolved together because they both have the ability to benefit each other. So we call this a relationship between a species and a biotic factor. If you look at this bird's beak, you can see that it is very, very bent to be able to get at some of the nectar at the bottom of this flower. And this flower has also evolved to facilitate the bird being able to do this. So both of these two organisms have evolved together, and so they share this relationship. If you remember back to when we talked about natural selection, if you remember, there was something called the struggle to survive. Oftentimes that is situated around limited resources in an environment. So all organisms within a community are competing for a specific amount of limited resources. These resources can be either biotic or abiotic. Food, water, shelter, and space are examples of the types of resources that organisms are going to be having a fight over. So this is going to be the struggle. It's going to be trying to get enough of these types of resources. Limited resources occur within every community, so there are patterns of interactions that develop between the organisms everywhere. So anywhere you go, there will be some type of limited resource that the organisms are going to be competing for. Even if you have an area where there's a lot of food, eventually there's going to be some kind of competition to get at certain resources. We're going to learn about the types of relationships that exist between organisms now. We break this into competition, predation, and symbiosis. And there's three types of symbiosis that we're going to learn about: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So you do not need to write this down yet, but you will need to write down in just a little bit, you're going to need to write down an example for each one of these terms. So we say competition is when two organisms use the same limited resource. A good example of this is the lions and cheetahs. So lions and cheetahs both feed on the same prey, so the presence of cheetahs in the lion's territory can lead to the competition for resources or food. Lions and cheetahs are constantly competing for the resources in their environment, so they're having to compete with each other. So we can say that competition exists between lions and cheetahs because they both feed on the same prey. So if you want to write a really good example in your notes, you can use the lion and cheetah competing for each other for their limited resources of the same prey. So the next example is going to be predation. One organism, a predator, consumes all or part of another organism. The lynx that feeds on the snowshoe hare is a really good example of predation. This cat-like creature that you see in the bottom left, it feeds on hares. We call this a lynx. So the lynx and the hare is another really good example that you might want to include in your notes. Now, if you have another example that you would like to use for your notes, that is completely okay, but the lynx and the hare was going to be the one that I'm going to share with you. If you have another example of predation, you may write your own. Symbiosis is the type of relationship where we have a long-term relationship between two species. There are going to be three types we're going to learn about: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So since we have the new Pixar movie, the Finding Dory, I just wanted to go and show kind of a clownfish and sea anemone example because this is a really great example of a symbiotic relationship. So as you can see here, the clownfish have a symbiotic relationship with the sea anemone because they use the sea anemone as a habitat. They use it for shelter, and the sea anemone in turn provides the clownfish also with some protection because a lot of times sea anemones, they have parts of them that can kind of sting or hurt other organisms. So the clownfish gets a really good deal here because it gets a home and it gets protection all at the same time. Mutualism is a type of symbiotic relationship where two organisms of different species both benefit. Bees and flowers are a great example of this because bees get food that they can later turn into honey from the flowers, and then while they're going from flower to flower, the bees are actually pollinating the flowers. So they're allowing the flowers, once these spread the pollen, they're allowing the flowers to be able to reproduce. Both organisms benefit in a mutualistic relationship. Both get something positive out of it. Now, that's not to be confused with our next type of symbiotic relationship, known as commensalism. So this is a relationship between two organisms of different species that benefits one organism but does not hurt the other organism. So in a commensalism relationship, one organism profits while the other one is just unfazed or unhurt by the whole thing. We can look at these barnacles on the whale's fin as being an example of commensalism. The barnacles get a home on the whale, and the whale, on the other hand, is basically unburdened by having the barnacles on its flipper. So we call this commensalism because one benefits while the other is unfazed by it. The third type of symbiotic relationship is known as parasitism. This is going to be a relationship between two organisms of different species that benefits one organism and hurts the other. So in a parasitism or in a parasitic relationship, one organism actually gets affected, and they get affected in a negative way. You can think of mosquitoes, fleas, tapeworms. All of these are examples of relationships between two organisms where one benefits while the other is actually hurt by the transaction. So hopefully you were able to get at least one example for each one. If not, then you might want to spend a little bit of time going over some of these just so that all the students are able to at least get an example of each one. So our question today that hopefully we can answer this now is, what type of relationship is represented in this picture? We have a white-tipped shark swimming in the ocean, and it has these black and sort of silver striped fish swimming next to it. Is this going to be an example of a mutualistic relationship, commensalism, or a parasitic relationship? So I want you to think about that. And tomorrow, when I see you guys again, we'll have an answer to this question. But for right now, I want you to think about this question, and we'll return to this tomorrow. At the bottom of your paper, I would like you to write a summary. And your summary is going to need to be 5 sentences long. And I want you to answer these 5 following questions. I want you to answer, how are ecosystems organized? So I want you to answer one sentence answering that question. What are biotic and abiotic factors? What are the types of consumers? What is a food web? And what are the 3 types of symbiotic relationships? So Mr. Hobbs, if you need to pause the video so that the students can read these, that would be, right now would be a great time to do it. I will be checking this tomorrow, making sure that you guys do this, but your summary does need to be 5 sentences long, and I want you to answer each one of these questions. It needs to be pretty thorough for you to get credit for doing this. So I'll check this tomorrow. You have the rest of the class period now to work on this. Thank you guys. I look forward to getting to see you guys again tomorrow.